Hi, everyone. All right. Oh, cool. Good to go. All right. So here's the outline of what we're going to do. So we're going to begin by introducing the domestic violence evidence in chief reforms. I'm going to move these microphones away because it feels loud over here. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Cool. What I'm going to do is we've actually done an evaluation on this a couple of years ago. So I'm briefly going to summarize the previous evaluation. I'm going to talk about what's changed and what's new. I'll then outline the data that we use. It's largely the same, so I'm just going to do it once. I'll cover the identification strategy, which at the end of this conference, you all know what that means now. I'll go through the results. Spoilers, they're different. I'll explain why they're different, and then I'll summarize, and there'll be time for a Q&A. Okay, so what is DVEC? So the first thing, DVEC is applicable to all DV charges commencing on or after the 1st of June. Now, what is DVEC? Essentially, DVEC allows victims to provide their testimony through a pre-recorded video and or audio statement with police for matters relating to domestic violence. So after the incident, in place of a written statement, the police can then sort of take a video interview with the victim, and then they can use that in criminal proceedings. So there are a couple of elements worth noting. First, obviously the victims have to consent. The police are supposed to take it as soon as practical to the time of the offence. Once the police have the recording, they no longer require the complainant's permission to play the recording at court. Although I'm told this is a very rare occurrence. Usually if the victim wants to back out, then the police don't proceed. The accused must see or hear the recording at least once prior to the court appearance. And the victim has to be available for cross-examination. So what were the objectives behind DVEC? So first, the idea was to reduce the trauma associated with recounting events in front of the offender. So it can be obviously traumatic, having to do that in court live. It also reduces the difficulty in recalling events for cross-examination. So basically, if you've been through this event, your court appearance might be a couple months down the road. So you can watch the recording and... Oh, that's much better. See, it's hard being short. My girlfriend, she's taller than me, so I wear a heeled boot everywhere now. She's still taller than me. She teases me about it. Now all of you can as well. So, moving on. The idea is to illustrate the demeanour and the experience of the victim proximate to the time of the offence. Why is that important? It can help ensure or raise the probability of a conviction. It obviously reduces the capacity of the defendant to intimidate the victim into changing or recanting their evidence because the police have the video. So if the victim tries to sort of do a U-turn, the police can be like, well, hey, why don't, rewatch this. This is a terrible experience. You should follow through. And finally, the objective, the only thing that we're capable of measuring is, in a quantitative study, is to look at the effect of the policy on the conviction rate and the number of guilty pleas for cases involving domestic violence. So this is the focus of the study. So how is DVEC rolled out? There's a special police directive that came out that said that only police officers with special training are allowed to take DVEC statements. Officers receive training at different times. Unfortunately, we can't see which officers got the training and when. And there was substantial variation in the uptake of DVEC across the local area commands, which is a lack, and that corresponds to a police jurisdiction. So what's the idea? Some local area commands had a whole bunch of their officers trained up a lot faster than others. So this is kind of just a visual representation to help set the scene. So what's going on? At the bottom, we have time measured on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we have the average number of domestic violence assault cases that a LAC deals with. This top series here is that number. You can see that there's a fair bit of seasonality, so they appear to sort of spike in the summer and they take a dip in the winter. This first line here is when the DVEC reforms came in. This second line indicates the time period that we had for the first analysis. So the first analysis, we had our before over here, we had our after over here, and we couldn't see anything over here. Now we've got the full time series. So what's this black solid line? This is the number of cases with a DVEC statement. So you can see it's flat before the policy comes in, and then it jumps up right before the policy is actually enacted. There's sort of a technical reason for that, so you can hit me with it in Q&A if you'd like. And then it jumps up and it's steadily increasing. This short dashed line here, this is the number of cases without a DVEC statement. So taken together, you can see that when the reforms kick in, DVEC is increasingly utilised by the police, and correspondingly, the number of cases without a DVEC is falling. So that's what that's supposed to illustrate to you. So this is the previous analysis. I'm just going to summarise what we found. So we found limited evidence to indicate that DVEC raises the probability of a conviction or technically a proven offence, at least one proven offence at the court appearance, by about 2 percentage points. We didn't find anything for guilty pleas, and we didn't find anything for plea delay. So what's plea delay? Plea delay is the number of days between charge and finalization conditional on the outcome being a guilty plea. So my co-author, Suzanne, so essentially wrote this, and in hindsight, it was a good thing she did. So it reads as, the impact of DVEC on court outcomes should continue to be monitored. It may take time for complainants to begin to trust the new process, be willing to consent to video statements and pursue criminal charges. Police expertise in collecting evidence of sufficient quality will also continually improve. Over the longer term, we may see the DVEC reforms achieve their ultimate aim to enhance victim safety and reduce domestic and family violence in our community. So that's the motivation for our study. This is the follow-up. So what's new? 2 things are new. The first is we have more data. The last report only had 15 months of post-policy data. Now we have 36, so it's more than doubled. What else is different? We have better methods. So what data do we use essentially in both studies? So we merge COPS, that's the data that the police have, with Boxar's reoffending database, which you've heard a whole bunch about. So in the end, we have a full list of court appearances that involve a domestic violence charge. We can see when the police arrived and charged them. We can also see the outcome of the charge and all of the defendant's characteristics. So we restrict our analysis to court appearances that involve at least one DV assault charge. So what's the difference between a charge and appearance? You probably know, but I'm going to say it anyway. Multiple charges can be finalised at one court appearance. The charges do not necessarily correspond to the same event. So you could have a whole bunch of different events, that is somebody committing crimes at different points in time in different places, and the crimes get grouped together and they're all finalised at the one court appearance. We're conducting our analysis at a court appearance level, and we're looking at court appearances that had at least one DV assault charge. The DV assault charge had to be reported to police between the 1st of June 2015, when the reforms kicked in, and the 30th of June 2018. We've got the usual controls, so we can see the defendant's age, gender, blah, blah, blah. We've also got a list of their prior offending history. We can identify the court that the case was finalised at, as well as the PAC that was responsible for charging the defendant. We've also got the offence and finalisation dates. There is a new variable. This is the new variable that we have in the data that we didn't have last time. We can uniquely identify the victims associated with each domestic violence assault incident in the data. Okay, so outcome measures. First outcome measure I call a conviction. Really, that should say a proven offence. What is it? It's the probability that the defendant is found guilty of at least one offence. The second is a guilty plea. That's the probability that the defendant pleads guilty to at least one offence. The third is a conviction at trial. Really, that should say a conviction at a defendant hearing, because we're only looking at matters finalised in the local court. Trial sounds cooler though. So how do we get that? We restrict the sample to cases that proceed to a defendant hearing, and then we estimate the probability that the defendant is found guilty of at least one offence. Lastly, we've got a withdrawal, and that's the probability that the prosecution withdraws all charges. Now, a DVEC statement can affect this guy, the probability of a conviction, through any one of these 3 channels. So in some sense, these 3 guys here, they fit inside of a conviction. So if we find something for a conviction, we then explore the mechanism. Is it a guilty plea? Is it a case that's proceeding to trial? Or is it because the rate at which the prosecution backs out is falling? Okay, so why is it so tricky? You know, we love going through methodology. I think it's because most of the time that we write papers, it's for an audience of people that are trying to destroy us. So we're very defensive with the work, and I can see that that's coming across. But here we go. So we can't just compare conviction rates in cases. We can't just compare conviction rates in cases with DVEC to cases without DVECs. Why not? It's because of omitted variable bias. What does omitted variable bias mean? Where does it come from? It comes from a factor that meets three conditions. The first is it has to impact the probability of a conviction. The second, it has to be correlated with whether or not a DVEC statement happens. And the third is we can't see it in the data. So omitted variable bias could cause us to either over or underestimate the effect of a DVEC statement. And here are three examples. I should probably come up with better names for them. I'm very open to suggestions during the Q&A if you have some. So the first is what I've been calling victim bias. What's the idea here? More cooperative victims are more likely to provide DVEC statements when prompted by police. More cooperative victims may also provide better evidence. So what's the idea here? Cases involving DVEC statements have more cooperative victims and are thus more likely to result in a conviction either way. We can't observe witness cooperation. The second problem is police bias. So in marginal cases, so say cases where there are no physical injuries, conflicting testimonies, police may more strongly encourage victims to provide a DVEC statement. Why is that? They think if we have the DVEC statement, we're going to get that case over the line and be able to get a conviction. What does that mean? That means that systematically, cases with DVEC statements actually have weaker evidence. So that could cause us to underestimate the effect of DVEC. Third possibility, visiting bias. So if we're talking about a household where the cops are rocking up every second week or something like that, then they might have more visits and they might develop a rapport with the victim. So they might be more likely to get the DVEC statement. And because they're showing up so many times and this is happening over and over again, they also might be more likely to get a conviction. All right, so there are three things we need to deal with. So there's a lot of math here. The thing you need to note from here is that there are 4 equations and 4 steps that we're going to go through in words instead of math. And the reason the math is there is because somebody asks me a question I get tripped up on, I have a pretty bad memory, so I can flick back, have a look at the equation, and then I'll know what's going on. So the first step is we purge the DVEC indicator of the problematic components. So what are the problematic components we can see in the data? First, we can see the severity of the offence. So for example, in cases of grievous bodily harm, you might be more likely to provide a DVEC statement. So we can control for that. We can control for the day of the week that the DV offence was reported to police. Why is that important? Police might work particular shifts. We can also control for the passage of time as DVEC becomes more and more increasingly utilised. We can control for seasonality in crime rates. So you saw those spikes in summer and the dips in winter. And we can control for time constant differences between PAC. So what does that mean? Some PACs have a lot more experience just in general with domestic violence than other PACs, for example. So that's step 1. Step 2, we then calculate each PAC's percentage of cases with a DVEC statement. So let's just call that the DVEC uptake rate. What's that? That's, for example, where's the time? I can't see it, whatever. So for example, if in, say, the Newtown Local Area Command in July 2016, if there were 30 domestic violence cases, 10 of them had DVEC statements, then that would be our DVEC uptake rate. Does that make sense? And then this is the tricky bit, so we'll see if we get through it. If not, then that's okay too. So for each case, we recalculate the DVEC uptake rate, leaving out all previous police encounters with the same victim. That's how we control the visiting bias. So one more time, for each case in the data, we remove all police the encounters the police have had with that same victim to sort of control for the fact that maybe police are visiting the same house a couple of times and building a rapport. So step 3, we then predict whether a victim provides a DVEC statement using this up here. And then we use this prediction to get the causal effects. So that's in a nutshell how we do it. Okay, so I'm going to be completely honest with you. I wasn't expecting that slide to be there. But since it's here, I'm going to very quickly break it down. For those of you with some familiarity with statistics, you'll recognize this as a probability density function. So what's the idea? You've got a probability here on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we've got our instrument, so that's when we look at the DVEC uptake rate in a particular pack, and then we control for all those things and remove the effect of pleas visiting the same victims twice. This is a visual representation of that variable. My former colleague Sarah actually presented yesterday, and she had a similar chart. Hers was a lot better than my chart, and I've tried really hard to get my chart to look as good as hers, and it's something we often joke about, that I can't do it, and I don't think I ever will. It's unfortunate. So the important thing to note here is this line, which corresponds to this axis. And what that says is, when you move from the packs with the lowest utilization of the technology to the packs with the highest utilization of the technology, the probability of a victim providing a DVEC statement smoothly increases, and that's good. So here are the results. There's a lot going on in the table, so we're going to go one row at a time, one column at a time. First thing I want you to do is just have a look at this top row over here. And then the first thing we're going to do, so these are the Ols estimates. What does that mean? That means all we're doing is we're controlling for age, age, gender, prior criminal history, all those kind of standard demographics that we can see in the data. We're controlling for the severity of the offense, the pack that responded to the call. We're taking seasonality into account. We're also controlling for the court that they go to. And then we're looking here. What does this mean? This means that cases with a DVEC statement are 3.2 percentage points more likely to result in a conviction. So that's what the 3.2 is. These things here in the brackets, they're standard errors. What you really need to worry about are these stars, and they indicate statistical significance. More stars is better. So now we move over here to the probability of a guilty plea, and we can see that cases with DVEC are 2.4 percentage points more likely to result in a conviction. For a conviction at trial, which remember is a defended hearing, we can see it's 4.3, and the probability of the prosecution withdrawing all charges goes down by 2.5%. Okay, so what are these estimates down here? This is when we control for police bias, victim bias, and police visiting the same household a couple of times. So these are the estimates we should really trust. So first, you can see that the effect has actually gotten bigger. Now cases with a DVEC statement are 6.4 percentage points more likely to result in a conviction. What does that mean? It means that the victim bias that pushes our estimate down was probably the wrong way to go, and it's something more along the police bias. Now, the exact mechanism that I described, so that's police encouraging victims more strongly in marginal cases, that's just a theory, that's just a thought. That's just me attempting to explain it. It could be something else. But either way, the fact that the estimate is getting bigger signals that something is pushing that effect down. So if you look for guilty pleas, the stars are gone now. Although the coefficient has gotten bigger, as you've heard many times, the problem with these kind of estimators is that they make the standard errors, these things inside the brackets, bigger, which means it's harder to get these stars. But here's the interesting thing. A conviction at trial, so for cases that proceed to a defended hearing, we can see a huge difference. And that means that DVEC really kicks in and really works for cases that proceed to a defended hearing. So that's where you can really see the effect. And again, we don't have any stars here for the prosecution withdrawing. So these estimates conflict with the previous evaluation. The good question is why? There are three possibilities. First, the policing community needed more time to adjust to the reforms, like in the quote that I read out earlier. Second, the old methods were incorrect and we just needed to use better methods. Third, it could be a combination of the two. So what we do is, to try and answer this question, we can use the new methods on the old data set. So if you remember that picture I showed you before that looked like this, and then we had the two lines, this is when DVEC came into effect, and this one was the cutoff for the old sample. What we do is we only use this data over here and we toss this guy away, and then we use the new methods. So again, a bunch going on. These are the two outcomes that were common to both studies. This is the old method, old data. So this row here is just a straight replication of the report that's already been published. These are the OLS results where we control for the stuff we can see, and these are the two-stage least squares results where we control for the stuff we can't see. So you can see this is for convictions, guilty pleas. This is the new method on the old data that we had available last time. So what do we see? First, if we look at convictions under OLS, it's a bit bigger, but the qualitative conclusion is about the same. DVEC is raising the probability of conviction by a pretty small amount. Two-stage least squares, no stars, and the qualitative conclusion is essentially the same, and that holds true for guilty pleas. So what's the inference there? It means that it took the police and the community more time to adjust to the technology and the practices. So this just summarizes the results. It took time for the policing community to fully adopt and adjust to the reforms. DVEC is raising the overall probability of a conviction. This is largely driven by an increase in convictions for cases proceeding to a defended hearing. We found only limited evidence that DVEC raises the probability of a guilty plea. Why limited? Because it was only significant under OLS. When we control for the other stuff, the stars go away, but the coefficient's bigger and it's in the right direction. So it could just be a sample size issue. Similar story for the prosecution withdrawing. And finally, the evidence seems to support the police bias style argument. Why? Because the two-stage least squares results are bigger than the OLS results. And yeah, that's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. We've got plenty of time for questions. We've got one at the back.
Hi, thanks for that. That was really interesting. I just want to ask something. I promise I'm not a person trying to tear you down. But in the beginning of the presentation, you said that or what you'd been told about the practice of using DVECs was that in practice, the police tended to not proceed if the victim became unwilling on the hearing day, and that the victim's still required to attend for cross-examination, which is what the legislation says. But just thinking about what that change in the effect that you observe with the second analysis, I just want to suggest to you that another reason for that might be that, in fact, in my experience, I'm a criminal defence solicitor, police proceed, at least in my area, virtually 100% of the time, even if the victim's unwilling. And quite often, not just in my area but in other areas, even if the victim doesn't turn up, the police will still seek to tender that evidence. And there are cases I'm aware of personally where police have sought to tender that video without the victim being there. That's been allowed. The victim hasn't been there for cross-examination. The defendant has been convicted, and that conviction's been upheld on appeal. So one thing that I just wanted to suggest to you about these results is exactly what you're talking about in terms of it's taking the community time to adjust to the new system. I'd suggest one factor might be that now that that system is in place, where the videos are getting played anyway, and sometimes people are getting convicted even if the victims don't show up, now that word's getting around about that might also increase not only the convictions at hearing, but hearing about that, you might find if you do this analysis and another couple of years that the guilty pleas have gone up as well.
So I'd say a couple of things. The first is, and this is kind of just fortunate, that if that is true, then it doesn't affect the results, which is good for me. But one thing I would say that kind of works against your argument is that if that were true, I would expect to see, are these slides still up? Cool. You'd expect to see a much stronger effect for prosecution withdrawing. So if what you're saying is true, and then the police have the video and they say, okay, the victim wants to back out, we've got the video, let's just proceed without them. You'd expect to see you'd expect this estimate to be a lot bigger because the police would be way less likely to withdraw in the case. So it's possible, and I have to talk to the guy that's been sort of helping me write this within the New South Wales Police. It'd be nice to be able to test that, so if we could get some information for cases that don't proceed and some cases that do, and look at their characteristics. So I'll keep it in mind, and I am recording this so I can go back and I won't forget about it. So I'll remember that.
That's a really helpful point that you just made, so thank you for that.
No worries.
So I'm coming at it from the opposite end. I've worked as a prosecutor previously. Did you do any research in relation
Yes,
to...
this is exactly what I wanted.
in
Fantastic.
We'll fight later. No, in relation to the applicability for the apprehended violence orders. So it's a domestic violence matter. There's an AVO that runs alongside it. In my experience, often though, the charges may fail if it goes to hearing. The use of the DVEC, again, in my experience, is that it will increase the likelihood of an AVO being made. Sorry?
So I've been told that it really helps in sort of obtaining a warrant so they can go after the defendant.
Well, yes, but I'm interested in whether or not, if there's any research that can run alongside this in terms of that it affects the likelihood of an AVO being granted. So while the charges may be lost, and that's unfortunate, often the hopes or the wishes of the victim is that there's just an AVO in place and they may not be as supportive of charges being made out. So, and in my experience with DVECs, often you won't get the charges made out, but you'll have a protection order, whereas in circumstances where you had a victim by themselves without a DVEC, you're likely to lose both, or you're more likely to lose both at hearing than you are when there's a DVEC.
So that's a fantastic suggestion. I think, so I'm not sure how I would do it in the data, although I'd have to do my homework. My guess would be that we could look at the legal action rate. That is the percentage of detected incidents that result in a charge. And then you could say, all right, well, our cases with DVEC statements more likely to result in the police proceeding to charge. So I'll have to think about it, but that sounds good. Yes.
Okay, well that's about all we've got time for, but I'm sure Steve is more than happy to answer any other questions later. That was our last session, so join me in thanking all